Hi everyone, my name is Rod Hempel and this is the Melbourne Xamarin and Blazor Meetup.
Hi Rod.
Yeah, lovely. So before we start, first to our sponsors, so Melbourne App Development is a sponsor, and Kim Philpox, Lachlan Gordon and myself, we run this. We run it regularly at the moment, monthly. This is a managed Zoom presentation. So during the presentation, please put your mics on mute and ask questions via the chat. After the presentation, we'll take mics off mute and you can ask the presenter direct questions, but please mute when you aren't talking. Without any further ado, I want to pass over to today's speaker, Lachlan Gordon. It says tonight's speaker. That's because we run that in the evening, which I guess it is over in Melbourne, over in the US. So Lachlan is a Xamarin developer, a Blazor developer. He's an audio engineer, and he also runs a Twitch stream. Tonight's presentation is on Blazor for Xamarin developers. So over to you, Lachlan.
Excellent. Can everyone see my screen? Showing something PowerPoint-esque?
Yes.
Excellent. Cool. Thank you for the introduction, Rod. As you said, I'm presenting on Blazor for Xamarin Forms devs. So I've been working with Xamarin for quite a few years and absolutely love it. But now and then there's a project that really should be on the web. And so dabbled in various web technologies over the years, but kind of found myself trying to avoid it because I love C# too much. But now that Blazor's come along, I'm really excited to be able to write web apps in C# and no more JavaScript, and to reuse as much of my skills and my code as possible. Just as a quick bit of context, the app I'll be using for most of the demos today is a bit meta. It's an app for the presenters, and it will eventually include presentations and more details for all the presentations we have at this meetup. So there's a list of a few of the ones we've had recently, and we'll be looking more at this as we get going. So kind of split this presentation into two halves. First half will be an intro to Blazor, and then the second half will be really how does that fit into the world of being a Xamarin Forms developer and how you can work with the code sharing. So cover what Blazor is, although I'm guessing if you're here, you've already got a bit of an idea. It's a new single page application or SPA framework from Microsoft. Don't get scared by it being called single page application. That doesn't mean you can only have one page in your app. It just means it all loads from the server as one page, and then everything else gets modified from there. But you still get to write as many pages as you like. It's all .NET, so you get to write C# or F# if you like, instead of JavaScript. And it can run in two ways. Client side is the really exciting one. That's built on WebAssembly, and so that's actually got your full .NET running inside the browser. Or the other option is server-side. So then you've got all that rendering done, or most of the rendering done in the server, and then that communicates with this, your client over SignalR. Here's a bit of an overview of kind of what that stack looks like. So on the left, we've got our WebAssembly. So you've got the browser DOM, that's all your HTML tags and that you've been working with in any kind of web project. Underneath that is a JavaScript bridge, which you can almost pretend doesn't exist, but it is an important part of how it works. The runtime that all of our .NET is running in is mono in WASM, WebAssembly. So they're saying inside the browser really is the key there. And then you write your user interface using C# and Razor pages or Razor syntax, which is what we've been using in ASP.NET MVC for a while now. And then beyond what's running inside the client, if you've got an API or a database behind it, that's kind of up to you. Build that however you like. A lot like if you've got a mobile app. Everything you write in your C#, you can make HTTP calls if you want, or it can be self-contained if you want. The alternative is the browser. As I said, there's the Signal R bridge, but you can also almost pretend that doesn't exist, because all that you care about is writing your C# and Razor user interface that ends up in the browser DOM. Document object model, that is. Shouldn't throw around acronyms too willy-nilly. Key bit here is that that is running on the server now. What's interesting is that you can get straight into the database, because you've probably got that database running on the same server or a server nearby. So no need for an API link between those two. Throughout this, at any time, please feel free to ask questions. If it seems like a good spot, and if I've said any questions, go ahead and ask them out loud. If not, type them in the chat anytime, and Rod will do the interrupting. So something to note with the client-side Blazor, it's still in preview, but it is working pretty well, and I'm using it in some things that'll be in production quite soon, whereas server is out now. The main reason it's not out called stable yet is they've got plans to make it faster in terms of which compiler and which interpreter they're using. Debugging experience isn't very good. There's no kind of debug from Visual Studio, but they're working on that. And also they're still working on getting the linker to work really well to get the app size right down. So at the moment, still a fair bit of a slow first load time on client. A couple of questions, either now or later, pros or cons of client side versus server side. Big pro for client side is cost. You can just host it on any old static file server. So I like to host mine in Azure Blob Storage, and you can host as big as you want for a matter of cents per month. Server, well, server side, one of the advantages, it's out now and stable. Another big advantage is because all of your code is or most of your code is executing on the server, you can go straight into the database or other server-side services without having an API layer in between. And also the debugging experience is a lot nicer. But WebAssembly is running in the client browser, which means it's got much better use in terms of offline. Once the page is loaded, the whole app will keep working, other than API calls. The server really needs a rock solid internet connection. Otherwise, it drops out. So that's a few of the pros and cons. If any more kind of come up as I'm going, I'll point them out when we get to them. But one important note is that the code is very reusable between the two. So if you start a project working server side, you're not committed to that forever. You can later on change it over to being client side, or you can even go for some kind of hybrid model where you've only writing that Blazor code once, but you can have it running on separate websites for client or server. So there's a few different ways people are looking into getting that working nicely. I think we've covered that. Yep, Twitch is in one of the later slides. So just to kind of look at a bit of the syntax and how we write Blazor apps. As I mentioned before, we're using the language CSHTML and Razor pages. So as the name CS_HTML suggests, it's C# and HTML kind of mixed in together. So kind of anywhere you see the @ symbol, there's going to be something C# that you wouldn't get away with in plain old HTML. So we're kind of seeing there, H1P button, they're all just HTML tags. Down here in the code block, just writing C#. And here this @ on click is pointing to a C# method down there. And there that @ current count is pointing to a C# field. In that first example, all of the code was in one class where we've got our HTML with the code block beneath it. You can instead shift this block of C# into a code behind file. So then you're going to have a public partial class counter. So similar to how you've got your XAML CS in Xamarin Forms. Here we can do very similar thing with code behind. Yay, webforms ASP.NET. Yep, you're going to see a lot in common. This should feel comfortable to people coming from web forms, but I guess there's a lot of new features as well and a lot of niceties. So it's pretty exciting times for anyone with either an MVC.NET or a web forms background. Here we've got just another example of kind of how that C# and Razor syntax can mix together. So here it's used so that if your data is still loading, it'll just show that loading page, or once it's ready, show all the content. So we say @if, and then we just write a plain old C# if condition expression. And then inside the braces of the if, you write HTML or CS_HTML. So that's just plain old HTML there. And then inside our else, we do the same again. We've got HTML table. Here we've got a button that links to one of our C# events. Then down here, we use a for each loop with C# kind of syntax for setting up the loop, but then HTML inside it. And there we see that @presenter.name. That's how we access the details of that presenter model. So a bit different to what you'd be used to seeing in Xamarin Forms, where we'll usually use a collection view or list view or some kind of repeater control. Here you just write a list, although there are third-party controls for achieving that kind of list stuff. So as well as putting HTML throughout your markup, there are built-in components. So they're going to look quite similar to HTML, and they do render down to being HTML once they end up in the browser. But they've just got a few extra properties to make it easier to hook them into your C#. And they kind of build out a UI framework just to help you along instead of writing everything from scratch in HTML. So an example of that here, an edit form. When you look at your when you look at the HTML in the browser, that will just be an HTML form. But here we've got some helpers to get us into C#. Same with the input text. That'll give you an input of type text. So there's a few of the different controls and what they render down to. So we've got input checkbox, input number, input select, and all the things they render down to. So you could just write that HTML if you want, but it's a bit nicer and easier to read if you use those built-in components. Next piece of the puzzle that you're going to need putting together a Blazor page is navigation. So at the top of any of your pages, you're going to say what its URL is. So in this example here, we've got an @ page and then /counter. That means you can navigate to it from anywhere in the app with that counter URL. Then one of the ways you can navigate is using nav links. So that's what you'll typically see in the navigation bar at the top or the left of an app. So here we've got one with 4 nav links on it, and one of them has the URL of counter. The other option, if you want to navigate to somewhere from in your code, is if you go navigation manager.navigate to, and once again, you just put in a URL that'll match what's at the top on that page. So this nav link here, fetch data, will get you to the same place as this navigation manager, navigate to. We can also pass parameters through our navigation so that you can get some data between your pages. Common example of that, if you've got a list of presenters, which we'll see shortly, if you want to view the details of that. So we put that on the end of our URL. So here I've said for this page, my presenter details page, if you put an ID on the end of the URL, we'll know what to do with it. And that property name there needs to match a property, and it needs to have that attribute parameter on it. And then when you pass in this URL, the ID property will go in there. They all go through strings in our URL that's up visible in the browser. So they're going to need to be fairly short. You can go with a string or a date or a double or a GUID or an integer. But you can't pass POCOs, so kind of your complex objects through, which is something we often like to do in Xamarin. Kind of comes from an idea in the web. If you go to a URL, it's going to load that data in. So it's kind of a shame. I miss passing through those objects, but there are ways to work it out if you want to. But basically, yeah, go with something that can be a short string because it will be visible to the user. So that's kind of navigation covered. Another important part that you'll need to get your head into is kind of the startup and DI process. Anyone who's worked with kind of any of the .NET web frameworks before will be fairly familiar with this. You're going to have either a program.cs or a startup.cs. And in there, you're going to have a service collection, which you'll add. In this case, I'm adding an HTTP client. You'll also add in your model services or anything like that. Any of those services you need in your page. And then when you want to get to them, you can use this @inject attribute. So to get your HTTP client, which you'll be using for any API calls, you do that, or you can put them in the constructor like you would with most other DI frameworks. JS interrupt is an important part, but hopefully you won't have to use it too much. Any JavaScript call that you can make, well, anything you can do in JavaScript, you can call straight from Blazor through this interrupt layer. So once you've got a JS runtime object, this example here does console.log hello.js. So you can just in that string write inline JavaScript, but it's a pretty horrible place to write JavaScript just in a C# string. What you're more likely going to do is have a function name for some C# that you've written. So as well as running your own code, this is also how you get into libraries. And we've also got the option to get callbacks, which means that the JavaScript can call into your C# code as well. So you may find when you're writing Blazor code that not everything is possible from there, but anything you could do in another web framework, you just need to go into this JS runtime. Another really cool thing about Blazor is just how many third-party components we've got access to. So all the NuGets you know and love from any .NET development, that's all available to you. JavaScript libraries, absolutely anything that's JavaScript you can get to through your interop as well. And then you've got some Blazor specific libraries. So these are probably a bit of a combination of a NuGet and some JavaScript. And a lot of them, they've kind of done that hard work of wiring up these existing web components or bits of JavaScript to some nice C# interfaces. So MatBlazor, I'm a big fan of, and we're lucky enough to have Sam in the chat, at the meetup today. So thank you very much. I love this library, and I know Rod's a fan too. Also some great controls out there from Syncfusion, Telerik, and Infragistics. This is by no means a complete list, just some of the ones that I've looked at. So I'm now going to go into a bit of a demo of a bit of an overview of what MatBlazor can do. So its core concept is material design for Blazor, which fits in quite nicely if you've been working with the visual material, because we've recently got material components in Xamarin Forms as well. But it's a bit more than that. This is kind of, it brings, to me, takes Blazor from kind of a framework where there's just some blank controls that are a bit ugly and not enough layout options, but it's a very baseline. This brings it up to a complete UI framework that you can really get into and whip up a nice looking UI quite quickly. So it gives you grid layouts, which if you're a Xamarin Forms developer, you love. Gives you pop-ups, toasts, card views, all the input controls like date pickers, text input that do the neat little hint pop-up. And it also gets you the material font icons for icon buttons without having to go hunting and loading in assets and everything like that. So there's a bit of an example of building a form in MatBlazor. So still that edit form is part of Blazor, but then this mat text field gives you that nice Blazor look. So I've got a handful of them down there, and then we've also got a mat button down here. So rather than just the black and white appearance, it gets you something beautiful. Here's the grid that I mentioned before. Similar to Bootstrap, it's kind of based all around the 12 because it's nicely divisible. So there's a div with a column span of 6. There's a 3, a 2, and a 1. So that's kind of how you'd build out a grid layout. And then we've also got the card view, which you'll see in the once we get into the demo in a bit, where it actually fits in. But we've got a mat card, and then we've got our content within there, and that's using the mat grid as well to lay out my content. Cool. So that kind of covers the crash course of an intro to Blazor before we get to mixing it in with the Xamarin Forms. Anyone got any questions on Blazor in general so far? Yeah, so AJ, you've got a bit of a history in web as well. So yes, this will be very familiar, but hopefully still exciting. Cool. Feel free to ask questions if they come up. If not, I'm gonna keep on. Oh, actually, one thing I will do before I get into the kind of code sharing part of it is show you a bit of the structure of what a Blazor solution looks like. So here I've got 2 projects that are not connected or anything. They're just in the same solution for convenience. This top one is what your Blazor server app looks like. And this bottom one is all WebAssembly. So I've got most of the same pages with kind of those code snippets we were looking at before. You've got your www root folder for kind of any of your assets that you want. We've got our nav layout that we looked at before with all those nav links, and kind of the header layout as well. So everything in here will just run on right in the browser. And that's all set up in Program CS. Over on our server side one, we've got a Program CS to get it started and also a startup, which is where you'll register your services and do a few other things. So this will be looking a lot like your .NET Core server-side app, which this is, but other ASP.NET Core server-side stuff, whereas the WASM one is a bit lighter weight because it's all running self-contained in the client. So the really exciting thing for me about Blazor is code sharing and getting some of that code that I've already written for my mobile apps running in the web as well. So any code you write in .NET standard code or in any .NET standard libraries, you can use in Blazor. In terms of writing your own code, that can mean your models and your view models. If you like to follow the MVVM pattern, they can all go to your Blazor and work in your Xamarin Forms as well. And then having a separate UI on each. So here's a bit of a history of code sharing. It's just going to be 4 graphs. So this is kind of a worst case scenario and how some companies work with no code sharing. So down the bottom, we've got our server-side section. Then you've got your client-side business logic stuff in the middle, and then a UI layer up the top. In this example, we've got an iPhone app written completely native in Swift, an Android app in Java or Kotlin, a Windows app in VB or something, and then there's a web app written in one of the JavaScript frameworks, and they all probably talk to the backend, but these developers probably don't get along very well, and they like to fight over model names and stuff like that. So there's a lot of duplication of work going on here, and no one likes that. So the next thing we can build up to, and this is what Xamarin brought in, and this is what maybe a bit more typical for Xamarin devs, and this is just looking at classic or native Xamarin. We've still got our web app and our web server sitting separate, but now we've got the business logic for all of our mobile and desktop shared across the 3, and then with 3 native UIs. One step further is when Xamarin Forms comes in. This is where we've now got shared business logic and a shared UI across those 3 platforms, and just tiny little head projects with hopefully not too much code in them. But still, with Xamarin Forms, you've got a web app that is completely separate with no code shared between it. So I've worked in a few companies that kind of follow this model, where you've got the mobile app with the Xamarin Forms that hits the API, and the web also shares the API, but not much beyond that in terms of sharing. What I've started getting into is all this shared business logic across iOS, Android, UWP, and web. So that's my view models, my services. That Xamarin Forms shared UI across the 3 mobile platforms and potentially desktop. And as well as getting that client-side code shared across the 3, we can share that code from the client side and the server side as well. So you can start sharing your models between the 2 of those. So we're getting to a point where a large majority of our code can be shared, but the database bit is still going to be a bit different, and you'll just be doing basically your user interfaces separately, although there's some sharing there as well. So this is what I think is the overall goal, unless we can get even further with more code sharing. So now I'm going to jump across to Visual Studio for the next little bit and kind of show you around how I build out an app that follows this pattern. And this is a time, very much feel free to jump in with questions. Otherwise, I'll just kind of show you the way through it.
You better expand your screen there a little bit, I think.
Yes, good idea. Thank you, Rod. So I'll start by showing you the app in action. So at the moment, VS Mac doesn't have very good support for kind of debugging and deploying Blazor WASM code, but it's a fair bit better with the server. So for now, if you want to run your Blazor WASM, you do that from the terminal, which is now built into VS Mac, which is great. So just a .NET run. And sorry, I can't zoom up the terminal, but hopefully all the files should be fine. And now over in my browser, this is the app I've built. So I've been building this out over the past few weeks on my Twitch stream. That's a list of the presenters from our app, from our meetup, this meetup. Click on one, there's all those MatBlazor views I mentioned and a MatBlazor button. We hit save and go back. And I've also got it, you can switch between these card views or a list view. And here's our nav section. It's a pretty simple app so far, but I'll be building this out further in the future. Then the other part of the app is running it on a mobile device. Spin it up on an iPhone simulator. Kim asks, what about Visual Studio Code? Is that a good environment to develop in? Yes, it is. So it's got really nice support with the integrated terminal there as well. And in the early, when I first started messing around with Blazor, I was doing that a lot in VS Code, but I do like the full-on IDE more than kind of the text editor approach of VS Code. So that's my preference, but yeah, VS Code got you covered there as well. I think I've got another simulator, but it's hiding. Can anyone see where that window went?
No.
Found it. Whoop. There we go. Here's my iPhone 11 simulator. So all the same functionality in here. We've got our list of presenters. Click on one. I've used the material design as well here, although that's using the visual material and the material components, but all the same functionality, kind of all the same navigation for now. So how I've kind of built that out from an architecture perspective, I've got this Melbourne Modern Apps.core. This is the code that is shared across all my platforms. So ideally I want to be writing as much code in here as possible, because otherwise I have to be writing it twice. So I've got my models in here, which so far is a presentation and a presenter. I've got my data store. For now, it's just in memory, but that would connect to a database or an API of some description, and my view models for each page. So my presenter's view model, for example, which is that screen with a list on it. Here we load them in from the data store, which means all the code on that page we've got running right here and also in the browser. Same again for the presenter detail view model. Here's where I handle all of my navigation, and then that also connects to the database. So all that kind of logic stuff is shared, which means when you add a new feature to the mobile app or the website, they all work on both. So that's the very core project, which runs everywhere: server, web client, mobile client. Then sitting on top of that is the Blazor WebAssembly project. Here I've written my presenter detail page, which has a reference to that item detail view model. So it's the same view model from before, and same in my presenters. So writing out a user interface in Blazor, the Razor syntax and CSHTML, the native there, but then all my code sitting underneath as much as possible in my view models. Kind of looking at a bit more at how these controls hook into that view model. There's my for each loop. So var presenter in vm.items. And then here we've got at presenter.name. This is kind of a bit like in your Xamarin Forms, where you're going to have in your data template binding name. So it's not quite the same syntax as the Xamarin Forms binding, but it gets you the same result of having the details in your view hooked up to that view model code behind. So in my code here, I'm trying to keep this as lightweight as possible and view only, and then that view model is where a lot of that happens. Over in this project is my Xamarin Forms project. Very similar to how you've probably written MVVM apps before, except the M and the VM are in a separate project, and here we've just got the views. So my presenters page.xaml. Here I've written a user interface in Xamarin Forms that sits on top of that same code, does all the same stuff. So that's kind of how this is all built out. And then, oh yeah, there's the Android project, which just has a main activity and some resources, and the iOS project's in there as well, with almost nothing in it. Add another head if you want to get Mac Desktop or UWP or any of those other Xamarin Forms targets. Anything in this code sample anyone wants to look at a bit more? Cool. We can jump.
Lachlan,
Yes, sir.
Can you jump to your view model?
Yep. Here's my presenter detail view model, for example.
Yep, they go up the top. You've got all of the set properties.
Yes.
Do your property notify. What does that do on Blazor?
Not really anything. So Blazor doesn't have a concept of notify property changed. It is just kind of always watching, and whenever anything changes, it re-renders the whole view, which sounds like a terrible idea, but somehow they've done it well, and it's incredibly fast. So from a Blazor perspective, this code is kind of a waste of time. You could just have all dumb get sets. Kind of the exception to that is if you're getting into asynchronous code, or if you've done something a bit more complicated. Sometimes when you change a value, it doesn't show straight away. And then you need to call state has changed. So in this one, for example, if when you clicked a button after an asynchronous call, you try to show some validation and it doesn't show up on your screen, you call state has changed, and that'll tell the browser rebuild the whole Blazor view. I'd kind of say 90+% of the time when you make a change to a UI or make a change in your view model that you've got it connected to, you don't have to do this. It just happens. Just every now and then something goes a bit weird and you need to give Blazor a bit of a nudge saying, go on, fix my view.
There's a question there from AJ.
Cool. If the Razor page had code in code behind file, what would it look like? I have an example of that over in the other solution. Here we are. So first off, here's the counter.razor that you get when you do the file new Blazor app, which has all of the markup at the top and then the code block down there. And now over here, I've got it with just the markup in a counter.razor, and behind it, all that same code, but now I've put it in a public partial class called counter. And that's got the Razor CS extension. And like with your XAML CS, that gets nested in Visual Studio automatically. It's kind of worth noting that this MVVM approach that I'm taking is not really typical of how most Blazor developers work. In Xamarin Forms, everyone's kind of, well, not everyone, a lot of people are all in on MVVM, but it seems in Blazor, most people are having their code in the code behind, so a lot of their kind of view logic kind of stuff just in the code behind and just the view in that Razor file. If I was working on a project where I wasn't using MVVM, I would separate this code out into a code behind. But given that I've kind of only got a couple of little stub methods here, and most of my code's in the view model, I haven't bothered separating that into a code behind file. Any more questions, anyone? Cool. I've just seen John Batchelor pop up in the chat. I met him at the Rochester Xamarin Meetup. So if anyone's looking for another virtual meetup to go to, the Rochester one's a great one. I'm glad to see we've brought him to Melbourne as well. I'll continue. How do you handle your build pipelines? I'm a big fan of Azure DevOps. And so I've got my Blazor repos hosted on GitHub. Azure DevOps hooks in nicely to them. And all this .NET Core stuff kind of can be built there. There's an Azure file copy task that copies your build output up into the Azure blob storage to hold it. Good. There's a link for the Rochester meetup. So yes, don't have any DevOps set up on this project yet, but on one of my Twitch streams, I will be getting that set up. But just yesterday, I was working on another project with a very similar architecture, where I've got all my projects building in Azure DevOps. So yes, it works quite nicely. I can show some snippets at the end of the presentation if anyone wants to see a bit more details on that. Cool. Come straight from a Zoom wedding. That's a good excuse to be late, I guess. Michael, follow-up question, but do you build the app and website at the same time? Perhaps I'll jump over to my Azure DevOps account to show you my approach for that rather than answering in the abstract. Right, do a little bit of that off screen. So this is an unrelated project called Burn Notification, but following very similar structure of having a Blazor and a shared with, and also the mobile apps. So this is my WebAssembly pipeline.
You might want to make that a bit bigger there, Lachlan.
Can do. So I've got it set that anytime I push to a branch called release/wasm anything, it will pull down my code, do a .NET Core build, publish, and then copy that up onto my Azure blob storage where I've got it hosted. In a very similar way, anytime I push to a branch with release iOS in the name, it installs my provisioning profiles, my Apple certificates, does a Xamarin iOS build, and distributes it via App Center. And that's all the same for Android, or very similar for Android as well, with the slightly different certificates. Let's see, lots of stuff going on in the chat. If I missed anything. Nope, all good. And then tied in there as well, which I haven't got in my solution here, is Azure Functions, which is what I'll be building the backend for this app in, and that's also sharing that same code. So that's how I set up my build pipelines. Everything is triggered by Git pushes. If you were in a larger team, you might want to do some of the more advanced release management stuff. But I'm the only dev on this project, and I don't really know how to do that release stuff. So you need to ask someone else. Cool. So just a few more, little bit of extended reading for anyone who wants to look into some more of this, some good resources. Or there's another way of doing WebAssembly and C#, and that's Frank Kruger's UI, which lets you write a Xamarin Forms user interface that does run WebAssembly in the browser, or you can also run it on the server. Then we've also got Blazor mobile bindings and Uno. So with the Blazor mobile bindings, you're writing Blazor syntax or Razor syntax and writing everything like you would with the Blazor app, except instead of using all those webby kind of controls, it uses the Xamarin Forms controls. So your stack layout, your button, all that sort of stuff. This doesn't build a website, it builds a mobile app. So the intention here is if you're good at Blazor, but you want to get into native mobile apps, you can use Razor syntax instead of XAML. Doesn't get you any more code reuse than what I've suggested here. So you can't reuse those Blazor views between your web and your mobile app, but it does let you use those same skills you've built out. That's UI by Frank Kruger that I mentioned. Potentially huge code reuse because you can write your views in XAML for both of them. It was kind of built about a year or so ago around the Xamarin Forms 3 time, but then just a few weeks ago, he did a big update live on Twitch. This is not an official Microsoft product. This is just a Frank Kruger project. It's a really cool idea. And then there's Uno, who let you write a UWP app, and that can then run in the web using WebAssembly. Now that UWP app could be written in kind of native UWP controls, or you can write a Xamarin Forms app in there. So that means you can end up with that one app running on iOS, Android, Windows, and the web. So then you can have fully shared views. This is also not an official Microsoft product. It's third party and it's open source. So I haven't looked into any of those 3 other approaches to doing this sort of stuff, but they're the interesting things to play with. I've kind of gone for the approach of Xamarin Forms plus Blazor with separate UIs because they're kind of where there's a lot of enthusiasm in the community at the moment and a lot of people getting on board with them. So now kind of getting out of the real content part and just a couple of other related things. This presenters app that I've demoed, I've been building on Twitch over the past few weeks. I'm online every Wednesday morning at 9 a.m. From whenever our presentation next month onwards, whatever is presented, I'll be building the following week. So kind of testing my learning from whoever the presenter is. So all that code's in github.com, Lachlan W. Gordon, Melbourne Modern Apps. And that's all at twitch.tv/Lachlan W. Gordon. A nice resource for if you're wanting to get into Blazor is by Ed Charbeneau. He's also a Twitch streamer. He works for Progress, working on the Telerik UI kit, but he's also producing a lot of good content for Blazor. So highly recommend that book and that content. So here's kind of a summary of all the stuff that's going on around our meetup and me. I recommend taking a screenshot at this page if you want to come back to any of these resources later. So this is the Melbourne Xamarin Meetup. We run every month on a third Wednesday in the evening. All these times I'm saying are Melbourne time. So that's Wednesday 6:30, which is going to be Tuesday late at night in America, or maybe very early in the morning. Australian Eastern Standard Times, yes. Sorry, I shouldn't be so Eastern Seaboard focused. This presentation URL, you can get to at bit.ly/Blazor presentation. All the code from today is in Melbourne Modern Apps. That's my GitHub repo. That's also where I'm doing all my Twitch stuff. There's also Twitter URL, GitHub, Twitch. Follow me in all those places. Cool.
Well,
that's the end of the presentation. Oh, Rod's got a question.
No, not a question. I was just going to thank you, Lachlan, and open the stream up for general questions. So if you got a question, please unmute and ask Lachlan directly. Come on.
Go on. Bring your cameras on too, so we can all see each other's faces. AJ's just posted a link in the chat of a nice resource. I might just open that up on screen since I'm still sharing and see what we've got.
This is Carl Franklin doing courses.
Oh, we couldn't find the page. Maybe I missed one letter missing. So Blazor Roadshow, no more. Blazor Desk Show. So this is Carl Franklin, host of .NET Rocks. Cool. He's running like full day paid workshops. Is that what this is, or are these other events?
These were free.
Cool.
I missed one of his first ones, but I tried watching one that was recorded. So it's more in depth than you're able to present in your short time. So he's spread it out. They're a little bit hard to figure out what time they are from an Australian point of view.
Yep.
All is Eastern Standard Time, so you go think, oh, Atlantic Eastern Standard Time. What?
We need to have permanent time converters or time zone converters on our computers, don't we?
Yeah. Although then you're getting the thing of, has it converted or has it not? Cool. Does he do, like, are these repeats of the same session, or is he building on it each time, extending the content?
I don't know. I've only just started watching them. So just the beginning one.
Cool. I guess I'll just have to find out. And then another resource shared in the chat from Kim, C# Fritz, another Twitch streamer, has a Blazor workshop. So, pizza. Some good resources there.
Lachlan?
Yeah.
Can I just pick up on something you said, answer the question about client-side versus server-side?
Sure thing.
There's one thing that you didn't mention. So because client-side runs on the user's computer and server-side runs on your back-end computer, what happens is that when you've got a large app, if you run it on the client-side computer and they've got an old computer, it doesn't perform very well. So,
yes.
So you've got So let me give you an example. For a mining site, so we did some work for an underground mining site. Their internet coverage is really bad because they're in remote areas. So for them, client-side app is just perfect. But for a basic user that has great internet, but a poor, like an old app, like an old computer, client-side's going to run badly. So in the end of the day, if you've got consumer apps, you've actually got to run both because different users. So different users. So you'll get a different experience depending on your user base.
Yeah. And I guess adding to that, WebAssembly's only been supported in browsers in the past couple of years. So if anyone's running a browser or a phone that's more than maybe 1 or 2 years old, the WebAssembly version just won't work at all. So that's another reason to have that fallback. And with the server side, which runs over SingleR, which is primarily using WebSockets, which most browsers have had for quite a few years, but even if for security reasons someone's disabled WebSockets, that server does still have a fallback going down to HTTP. So it will work in a lot more browsers. So yeah, as you say, having both is best.
And in fact, I suspect that once client-side becomes released, that we'll probably be running both and having the client switch based on dynamically switching, because really it's just a different URL. So if you can dynamically switch based on which version of operating system they're running, or you can even test the response time while they're running and dynamically switch, so you can change the user experience dynamically. But that's certainly possible right now, but it'll depend on what happens when the client side gets released.
Yeah, and I think that's something that a lot of people will roll their own for maybe a year or so, and then and maybe some third party like MVVM framework or framework kind of people will build solutions to that. I think we'll see for a while before there's an official solution, so that they can kind of have a bit of a chance to check what does work, what doesn't work. So Kim asks, what defines if it's server side or client side? Maybe I'll take back my screen. And in this example, so here I've got a server one and a WebAssembly one. As far as all you really need to know is when you say file new, there's a checkbox to choose which one, but where that's mainly defined in this WebAssembly CS proj, we can see there's dependencies on the WebAssembly packages, and also the project SDK type is sdk.web. When I look at the project file for the server-side version, there's almost nothing in there. It's just kind of the default assumption if you're making a, I did the opposite of what I wanted. When you make a CS project, is that it will be a .NET Core app running on the server side unless you say otherwise. Then in terms of building, when you hit .NET Build or .NET Run, one of them spins up builds a .NET Core app that needs to be running on a server somewhere, and the other one just builds some static files that get served out and loaded into the browser. In client-side WASM, is there any security concern about uploading all your DLLs, especially all your code, into the browser for others to have access? So yes, there are people working on that, and that's something that they'll have a better answer to before WebAssembly is called public stable. So this is something that for as long as you've been doing any client-side JavaScript development, that does load full JavaScript human readable or maybe minified into the browser. So this is similar to that, except now you're loading the DLLs. So DLLs are decompilable, but that's a bit harder and a bit more obfuscated already, but DLLs are close to being open source. So yes, be careful about what you put in there, as opposed to doing server side where everything is on your server and a bit more controlled. So yes, there are security concerns. People are working on more secure ways than just loading the DLLs and how to obfuscate them.
Now, Lachlan, we've run to our hour.
Cool.
I think that questions are slowing anyway. I think that we should. There's one more question there from AJ. Do you want to answer that, and then we'll close up, I think.
So from a user point of view, do they look the same? Yes, they do. The main difference you might notice is when you load a client one, you see that loading ... or you can make your own page, because in that first few seconds, it is loading .NET into your browser. Whereas on the server, it kind of renders on the server, and so that first page will be shown much faster. The other issue is once it's loaded, if everything's in the browser, this is going to run much faster, whereas on the server, that will take a little bit longer. Or if your internet goes down, client side keeps running, server side, you'll see error messages. But yes, this page will look identical.
Lachlan, do you want to put up your very last slide so people know how to contact you? And then we will, so if anyone wants a copy of that, this is the right time. Thank you everyone for your attendance. Thank you very, very much, Lachlan, for your presentation. And hopefully we'll see everyone at our next meetup.
Thank you, Rod. Thanks everyone for coming.